I am Jane, 26 years old, and the story I am about to tell you is carved deep into the marrow of my soul, etched into every scar life left behind when I was forced to fight for my very existence. From the outside, I may appear composed, a woman in her mid-20s with steady eyes and a firm voice, but beneath that exterior lives a storm, one that began the day my uncle looked me in the eye and declared, "A daughter can never be an heir." Those words were not simply an insult thrown carelessly into the air. They were a verdict, a punishment handed down to me as though I were guilty of being born with the wrong identity. I remember standing there in the family's dimly lit study, the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner like a slow drumbeat of doom, as my name was meticulously erased from the property papers in front of my eyes. Every stroke of the pen felt like a blade cutting away the ties that bound me to the home I had grown up in, to the legacy my late father had promised I would share. I wanted to scream, to plead, to demand that justice acknowledge me, but the icy glares from my uncle, my cousins, even the silent approval of the notary at the desk made me realize my words would have been swallowed whole by their greed. At 26, I should have been securing my future, dreaming of what kind of life I could build, but instead I was being methodically cut off from the soil of my ancestry, reduced to nothing more than a shadow who once belonged. What haunted me most was not simply the betrayal, but the fact that no one, not even my aunt who had once braided my hair as a child, stood up to defend me. The family name, the vast estate, the sprawling fields and towering mansions, all were being passed over me as though I did not exist. Yet in that moment, though humiliation burned my face and fury thundered in my chest, something inside me hardened. I vowed silently, while pressing my trembling hands into fists, that I would not vanish like they wanted me to. If I was going to be erased, I would carve myself back into history with such ferocity that not even their wealth or power could bury me. And as I stood outside the gates that night, watching the lights of the mansion flicker in the distance like mocking stars, I had no idea that the very will they thought excluded me would one day be the weapon that brought me back into their world, not as a discarded daughter, but as the rightful heir they tried so desperately to silence. The night after I was cast out from the estate, I found myself wandering the deserted streets with only the echo of my uncle's voice ricocheting through my mind. A daughter can never be an heir. Those words gnawed at me, not just because of the cruelty behind them, but because of the centuries of prejudice they carried, a weight that had suffocated countless women before me. I remember sitting on a cracked stone bench near the river, the moon's reflection trembling across the black water, and wondering how a family bound by blood could so ruthlessly discard one of its own. The wind that night was sharp, cutting across my face like shards of glass, and with every breath I drew in, I felt my resolve begin to solidify. I replayed in my head the images of my uncle's smirk, my cousin's condescending laughter, the sound of paper shuffling as my name was struck from inheritance, scenes that felt more like a trial where I had been sentenced without crime. I clenched the silver pendant my mother had given me before she passed, the only possession I carried, and whispered into the night that I would not let this end me. But the truth was, I had nowhere to go. Friends turned distant once they realized siding with me meant defying the family's powerful influence, and neighbors avoided me as though I carried misfortune on my shoulders. For weeks I lived off scraps, sleeping in bus stations and abandoned warehouses, my body shivering through nights that seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet hunger and cold did not break me, they sharpened me. Every indignity became fuel, every cruel whisper in the market, every pitying glance from strangers added another layer to the armor I was forging within myself. I began to study people, their movements, their motives, the subtle games of greed and betrayal that operated in plain sight. It was then, in my low estate, that I realized knowledge would become my weapon. I borrowed books from dusty libraries, stayed hidden in corners, consuming history, law, and every account I could find of families torn apart by inheritance wars. What seemed like tragedy at first was shaping me into something else, a survivor with eyes wide open to the corruption of the world. I didn't know it yet, but the seeds of revenge were already taking root, watered by the tears I shed alone at night, And one day those seeds would grow into a storm that would shake the very foundations of the family that abandoned me. Time has a strange way of molding pain into purpose, and as months stretched into years, I refused to allow bitterness to consume me, even though every memory of the estate's golden halls and manicured gardens felt like a blade twisting in my chest. Instead, I devoted myself to discipline, transforming weakness into strength one deliberate step at a time. During the day, I took whatever work I could find, cleaning shops, waiting tables, carrying heavy loads in markets, and though my body ached from exhaustion, I refused to let despair chain me down. At night, under the dim glow of flickering street lamps or in the silent corners of libraries that stayed open late, I poured myself into study. Law fascinated me most of all, not the dry statutes on dusty pages, but the power hidden in words, signatures, and loopholes that could dismantle empires or restore what was unjustly stolen. I began keeping a secret notebook, filling it with everything I learned, sketching diagrams of family trees, inheritance laws, and old cases where daughters had fought back against tradition. Each page was a map guiding me toward the future I refused to surrender. By the time I turned 26, the girl who had once been left shivering and hungry on the streets had become a woman armed with knowledge, resilience, and an unshakable will. Yet beneath that strength lay a silence, an ache that surfaced in quiet moments, reminding me of the mother who once whispered bedtime stories, the father whose promises were stolen before they could be fulfilled. I often dreamed of them, their faces blurred by time, and wondered if they would have fought for me had they lived to see my uncle's betrayal. That longing could have broken me, but instead, it lit a fire. If no one else would fight for me, then I would fight for myself, and for every daughter silenced by the arrogance of men who believed bloodlines ended at sons. Still, I carried no certainty of victory, only the haunting question of whether all my effort would matter when faced with the fortress of wealth and power my family guarded so jealously. But fate, unpredictable and merciless, had its own plans, and it was a single letter sealed in thick ivory paper, stamped with the crest of my grandfather's old law firm, that would thrust me back into the very world I had been forced to abandon. The letter arrived on a morning so ordinary that its weight felt like a rupture in time itself. I had been sitting in a cramped cafe, scribbling notes for a case study I was reviewing, when a courier appeared at my table, his face unreadable as he slid the ivory envelope across the chipped wooden surface. My heart thudded against my ribs as I recognized the insignia of my grandfather's law firm, a crest I had not seen in years, but could still trace with my eyes closed. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, and with every word I read, the air around me seemed to thin. The letter summoned me to the reading of a will, one that, according to the lawyer's careful phrasing, would concern matters of inheritance and family legacy. I nearly laughed aloud at the irony. Hadn't they erased me from the papers long ago, reducing me to nothing more than a forgotten branch of the family tree? Yet here was an invitation, written in black ink that seemed to pulse with the weight of hidden truths. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake in my tiny rented room, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, replaying every betrayal, every moment of abandonment, until the hours blurred together. By dawn, I resolved that no matter what awaited me at that gathering, I would face it head-on. The day of the will's reading was heavy with rain, the streets slick and shining as though the sky itself was weeping. As I approached the towering building where the law offices resided, memories crashed over me. The gilded halls of my uncle's mansion, the laughter of cousins who once mocked me, the echo of slammed doors that had shut me out. Inside the boardroom, the air reeked of polished wood and cold ambition. My relatives were already there, dressed in expensive suits, their eyes narrowing the moment I entered, as though I were an intruder trespassing on sacred ground. My uncle smirked, whispering something to his son that made them both chuckle, but I ignored the bile rising in my throat. I took my seat silently, clutching the silver pendant at my neck, anchoring myself with the memory of my mother's touch. The lawyer, an older man with weary eyes and a voice that carried the gravity of secrets, began shuffling papers, his deliberate movements stretching the tension to a breaking point. When he finally spoke, the words struck like thunder. The heir to everything is not the one written in these erased documents, but the one who endured abandonment, injustice, and silence, the one they all rejected. And as the room erupted in shocked gasps and furious protests, the lawyer's gaze locked firmly with mine, and in that still moment, I knew the tide of destiny had turned. The silence after the lawyer's words was suffocating, yet beneath it roared a storm of rage, disbelief, and venom that no one dared conceal. My uncle was the first to break, his chair screeching backward as he slammed his fists onto the polished mahogany table, spittle flying from his mouth as he barked accusations. "This is a trick. She was erased from the papers. She is nothing." His son echoed him with a sneer, tossing me a glare sharp enough to slice through bone, while my aunt clutched her pearls and gasped as though the very air had betrayed her. The lawyer, however, remained unflinching, sliding the will across the table with a calmness that only fueled their fury. "These are the words of your father," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He recorded them personally, ensuring no manipulation could alter his intent. The weight of that revelation hit the room like an earthquake, shaking every smug certainty they had constructed around their imagined supremacy. My uncle's face turned crimson, his veins straining against his skin as he jabbed a finger toward me. "She doesn't deserve a single coin. She abandoned this family." The irony burned inside me, because it was they who had cast me out, left me to freeze on the streets, and yet here he stood, rewriting history to mask his own guilt. I wanted to rise, to shout the truth, to tear open the lies with the fury I had carried for years, but I forced myself into stillness. My silence was my weapon now, my very existence a reminder that their cruelty had not broken me. The lawyer continued, his tone deliberate and unwavering. "The estate, businesses, lands, and holdings, all of it passes to Jane. This was your father's final decree, sealed with his signature and protected by the law." Gasps rippled around the room like waves crashing against rocks, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in my uncle's eyes, quickly masked by seething hatred. My heart pounded, not with triumph, but with the weight of realization. I now held everything they tried to steal from me, every field, every mansion, every thread of legacy that had once been denied. And yet, as I sat there, gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles whitened, I understood this was not the end of my battle. It was only the beginning, for power does not come without enemies, and vengeance never dies quietly. The days that followed the reading of the will felt like walking through a battlefield littered with invisible mines, each step heavy with the knowledge that my every move was being watched, dissected, and plotted against. My uncle's fury did not dissipate in the silence of that boardroom. It fermented, dark and poisonous, seeping into every corner of my existence. Anonymous letters began to arrive at my apartment door, slips of paper with crude threats scrawled in jagged handwriting, promising ruin, disgrace, and even death if I dared to claim what was now legally mine. At night, I would hear footsteps lingering outside my building, shadows that stretched too long under the street lamps, whispers that died into silence when I turned too quickly. Fear might have once paralyzed me, but now it only sharpened the edges of my determination. I began attending legal meetings with the estate's advisors, poring over documents that detailed the vast network of businesses, properties, and assets I had inherited. With each signature I added, I felt the chains of the past snap, yet simultaneously the noose of responsibility tightened. My cousins glared at me across the polished conference tables, their smiles masks stretched too tight over bitterness, their hands trembling when they signed acknowledgments that confirmed my control. Still, I trusted none of them. Their eyes betrayed them, calculating, desperate, enraged. I could almost hear their thoughts clawing at me. She stole what should have been ours. She will pay. It was during one such meeting, as I traced my finger over the intricate details of land ownership records, that I discovered something startling. Entire sections of property had been sold off under suspicious circumstances just months before my grandfather's death. When I demanded explanations, my uncle shifted uncomfortably, his voice faltering as he claimed it was all approved and legitimate. But my instincts screamed otherwise. A hidden corruption had been festering beneath the estate long before I re-entered the picture, and now that I stood as heir, those buried secrets threatened to surface. The realization struck me cold. This battle was not merely about inheritance or revenge. It was about uncovering truths they had spent years concealing, truths that could destroy reputations, expose crimes, and perhaps even explain why my grandfather had chosen to entrust everything to the very girl they had cast aside. The more I dug into the estate's records, the more the shadows deepened, as though every page I turned peeled back layers of rot that had been festering behind the family's golden facade. Late into the nights, I sat surrounded by stacks of ledgers, contracts, and bank statements, my desk cluttered with highlighters and handwritten notes, the dim lamp casting long, sinister shadows across the walls. It was in one of those long vigils that I uncovered discrepancies too precise to be mere mistakes. Forged signatures, doctored entries, transactions routed through shell companies I had never heard of. Each line of deceit whispered the same truth. Someone within my family had been bleeding the estate dry long before my grandfather's death, and they had grown bold enough to think their theft would go unnoticed. I began to suspect my uncle, but the deeper I looked, the more I realized the rot spread wider. My cousins' names appeared on company documents, my aunt's approval scribbled in margins, a web of collusion that made my stomach churn. Betrayal wasn't confined to a single hand. It was an entire orchestra playing in discord, their greed harmonizing in a symphony of corruption. Yet amid the despair, a strange clarity rose within me. This was why my grandfather had chosen me. He had seen through their masks, witnessed the greed that dripped from their every word, and in the quiet wisdom of his final days, decided to entrust everything to the one they thought weakest. That knowledge should have comforted me, but instead, it terrified me, because with power came danger. Already, I noticed how cars slowed suspiciously near me when I walked home, how calls would come at odd hours and fall silent the moment I answered, how even strangers' eyes seemed to linger too long on me. I began carrying pepper spray, sleeping with the faintest hum of adrenaline coursing through me, as though my body had accepted that survival was no longer just about resilience, but constant vigilance. Still, I could not turn back. If my family thought they could intimidate me into surrender, they had underestimated the very woman their cruelty had forged. Each discovery became a weapon, each document a bullet loaded into the arsenal of justice I was building. And though fear stalked me like a shadow, another presence stirred beneath it, an unyielding hunger for truth, and the growing certainty that exposing them would not only secure my rightful place, but also avenge every sleepless night I had endured since the day they cast me aside. The first time I confronted my uncle with the evidence, the air between us crackled with a venom so sharp it felt almost tangible, like a live wire stretched between predator and prey. I had arranged the meeting in the same boardroom where the will had been read, deliberately choosing the place where his arrogance had once triumphed, hoping the walls themselves would remember the shift in power. As I slid the folder of documents across the polished table, his eyes flickered with something he tried to mask. First surprise, then panic, and finally a cold, murderous rage. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," he hissed, his voice low but quivering with suppressed fury. My cousins exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence cracking as they realized the secrets they thought buried were now bleeding into daylight. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady though my pulse raced beneath my skin. "On the contrary, Uncle," I said, "I know exactly what I'm meddling with: fraud, theft, and betrayal. And unless you want every detail dragged into court, you will explain how millions vanished before my grandfather's death." His face flushed crimson, veins rising on his temple, but he said nothing. The silence was answer enough, a confession without words, and in that stillness I felt the power tilt fully in my direction for the first time. But power is a dangerous drug, and though victory glimmered faintly in that moment, the unease in my chest warned me it would not last. Later that night, as I walked home beneath a sky smothered with storm clouds, I noticed a black sedan creeping along the curb behind me, its headlights dimmed, its engine humming like a predator breathing down my neck. My pace quickened, heart hammering against my ribs, but no matter how many turns I took, the car followed, relentless, patient. By the time I slipped into the safety of my apartment building, my hands shook so violently I could barely fit the key into the lock. That was when the realization hit me like a tidal wave. My uncle and his allies were no longer trying to outwit me with legal games. They had shifted to something darker, something primal. This was no longer about inheritance, it was about survival. They had crossed a line I had sworn would remain uncrossed, and in that moment the sharp, urgent clarity of survival eclipsed every other emotion. I began to move differently. Caution became my closest ally, and patience my most effective weapon. I installed security cameras at my apartment, changed routines, and refused to walk alone after dark. But more than physical defenses, I turned to the only thing that had served me well since I was young, the relentless accumulation of knowledge. I hired a discreet investigator whose steady hands and quiet methods uncovered patterns the estate's glossy reports had obscured. He traced the diverted payments, followed ghost accounts through layers of shell corporations, and found recorded conversations that, when stitched together, formed a damning narrative of collusion. Every evening I would sit with him, reviewing transcripts and listening to shaky voice recordings where my uncle's voice tangled with other family members in hushed, conspiratorial tones. Each admission, each careless boast they thought forgotten, tightened the web of evidence around them. Still, gathering proof is only part of the war. One must also protect oneself from those who will do anything to silence exposure. I began to meet with trusted journalists and legal counsel, planting seeds in controlled ways to ensure that if anything happened to me, the story would not die in some buried file. In parallel, I quietly restructured portions of the estate, using legitimate clauses to lock assets and prevent further siphoning while we prepared to press charges. Those moves enraged my relatives further, and the threats escalated from anonymous notes to staged accidents that left my car windows smashed and tires slashed. Once, as I left a meeting, a stray hand reached through a car window and slid a folded note under my windshield wiper. A single line: "Stop or lose everything." The note was meant to terrorize me, but it had the opposite effect. It steeled my resolve and clarified the stakes. I realized this fight was no longer about personal vindication. It had become an obligation to the truth and to the quieter victims whose names never made it into ledgers. Documents revealed charitable funds diverted into private accounts, pensions erased, and employees coerced into false statements. The corruption had eaten more than property. It had consumed lives. Empowered by evidence and driven by the memory of nights I slept shivering and abandoned, I formalized complaints with the authorities and presented the dossier to prosecutors with a trembling hand that refused to falter. The prosecutorial response was cautious but decisive. Investigations were opened, assets were frozen, and subpoenas issued. Watching my uncle's carefully composed mass crack as investigators called his office and summoned him under oath felt like watching a performance finally exposed for its cheap construction. But as he sat under the harsh light of depositions, so too did he summon his last line of defense: intimidation bordering on violence. Strangers followed frozen into my periphery, and one of my most trusted aides woke one morning to find a brick thrown through his living room window. Each escalation reminded me that justice is not a straight path, but a jagged climb surfaced with sharp, treacherous rocks. Yet for every brick or broken window, more voices rose. Employees who had been too frightened to speak now reached out, offering names, dates, and documents. Their bravery was contagious, and the narrative began to shift from my lone struggle to a collective uprising against a hidden machine of greed. I found allies in unexpected places: a retired accountant who had grown weary of lying for the family, a young paralegal who risked her job to hand over a thumb drive containing ledgers, and a former driver whose late-night delivery routes had recorded conversations proving illicit transfers. With each added testimony, the image of what had been done to the estate became clearer and uglier, and the prosecutors who at first moved cautiously began to escalate their tactics with a new urgency. Yet still, There was a shadow I could not bring into the light. The reason behind my grandfather's absolute confidence in me. I knew in my bones that he had seen more than the numbers. He had seen character, and more importantly, the scars of abandonment that shaped me into someone who could not be bribed. As the indictments mounted and the news cycle started to pull the story into public view, my uncle lashed out in public, orchestrating smear campaigns aimed at discrediting me as unstable, greedy, and dangerously ambitious. He painted himself as a grieving steward wronged by a manipulative outsider, but the facade crumbled with every new affidavit and each corroborating witness. In clandestine phone calls my investigator recorded, my uncle's voice slithered between threats and bargaining. He attempted to buy silence with promises and veiled threats, but those offers were poisoned by the knowledge that his hands were already stained. I understood that to truly sever the rot, I had to win not only in court but in the court of public opinion. I had to show that this battle was not about wealth but about accountability. So I met with broadcasters, prepared statements, and allowed a carefully vetted journalist to run an expose that laid the groundwork for the legal storm we had unleashed. The morning the piece aired, my chest filled with conflicting emotions, vindication, fear, and a strange melancholy for the family I had once wished to belong to but which had proven itself unworthy. The public's reaction was a tidal wave. Whispers evolved into outrage, and townspeople who had once admired my uncle now demanded answers. For the first time since the day my name was erased, I felt truly seen, not as a pawn in their game, but as a woman claiming the full scope of her life back. The fight had cost me everything, yet I refused to bend. Each scar was a testament, and I would press on until truth and justice were won. I persist. The day the first hearing commenced, the courtroom buzzed with an energy that felt both suffocating and electric, as if the walls themselves knew they were about to witness a reckoning decades in the making. I walked through the heavy oak doors with my head held high, the weight of countless sleepless nights pressing against my spine, yet my resolve sharper than ever. My uncle sat at the opposing table, flanked by lawyers in crisp suits whose cold efficiency masked the fear simmering underneath. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the briefest second, the mask cracked. Behind the arrogance was a flicker of desperation, a silent plea that perhaps the tide might still turn in his favor. But it was too late for silent pleas. The prosecutors opened with the evidence I had spent months gathering: bank transfers, falsified contracts, sworn affidavits, and recordings that carried his unmistakable voice dripping with contempt. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow in that silent chamber, and I could see the jury leaning forward, their brows furrowing as greed was stripped bare for what it was. My uncle's lawyers objected, twisted narratives, painted me as vindictive, but every counter they raised unraveled under the sheer weight of documented truth. Then came the testimonies, employees, accountants, even distant cousins, each voice trembling yet resolute as they revealed layers of deceit long buried. The most damning was the driver's recording, played aloud in court, where my uncle bragged about bleeding the estate dry, laughing at the naive girl who would never know how deep the corruption ran. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye turned to him, and for the first time, I saw shame scorch his expression. Yet, even cornered, he lashed out, slamming his hand on the table and accusing me of betrayal, claiming that family should protect family. His words rang hollow, a grotesque echo of the same mantra once used to erase me from inheritance, to strip me of belonging. I stood when given the chance, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest, and told the jury what he never expected to hear: that true family is not bound by blood but by loyalty, integrity, and love, and he had desecrated all of it. The gallery stirred, whispers swelling into gasps, and even the judge's gavel could not completely silence the moment. I had spoken not just for myself, but for everyone whose trust had been broken, whose livelihoods had been stolen, whose dignity had been trampled under the weight of greed. The court recessed that day with the air thick in tension, verdicts yet to be decided, but truths now undeniable. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones crowded my face, reporters begging for comment. But I gave only one line: this fight is not about fortune. It's about justice. In that moment, I was no longer the abandoned daughter or the rejected heir. I was a voice for those who had been silenced too long. Yet I knew the battle was not over. Verdicts could shift, influence could seep in, and the corrupt rarely surrendered without one final, desperate strike. As night fell and I returned to the quiet of my apartment, I found another note slid under my door. This one shorter than the last, written in hurried, almost panic scrawl. You don't know the whole secret. Stop before it destroys you. My blood chilled, for though victory seemed within reach, I realized the deeper truth. The inheritance was not just about wealth, but about something hidden in the shadows of my grandfather's legacy, something my uncle feared more than prison itself. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from that note echoed endlessly in my mind. You don't know the whole secret. Stop before it destroys you. It wasn't a threat in the way the others had been. It was a warning, trembling with the kind of urgency that only comes from someone who knows they are running out of time. I sat at my desk with the scattered papers of the estate sprawled before me, every line of every document suddenly appearing incomplete, as if they hid something just beyond reach. My grandfather's will, which had felt like a shield of protection, now read like a riddle he had left for me to solve. Why had he chosen the words, the daughter everyone rejected, instead of simply naming me? Why cloak the inheritance in metaphor when clarity would have ended any dispute? The questions chewed at me, clawing against my confidence until curiosity burned brighter than fear. I returned to the estate house the next morning, moving through its echoing halls that smelled faintly of dust and old wood, guided by an instinct I could not suppress. My footsteps drew me to my grandfather's study, untouched since his passing, its shelves lined with books I had once seen him disappear into for hours. I pulled volumes at random, searching for a sign, until my hand grazed a leather-bound ledger tucked behind rows of encyclopedias. It was unmarked, its pages filled with his handwriting, detailed accounts, names, dates, payments that weren't about wealth but about silence. Each entry was proof of decades of payoffs to keep something hidden, a secret too dangerous to escape into the open. As I turned the pages, my breath caught at a name I recognized, my mother's. Payment after payment had been made in her name, not for luxuries, but for silence, for keeping some truth buried beneath the weight of money. My heart raced, my skin prickling as the realization sank in. The betrayal I thought had begun with my uncle might have roots that reached deeper, darker, and closer to the people I once longed to trust. Before I could process the enormity of it, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, clutching the ledger to my chest, and there in the doorway stood my uncle, his eyes wild, his voice low and venomous as he whispered, "You weren't supposed to find that. Now you've gone too far." The air in that study turned suffocating, the walls pressing in as my uncle stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the dusty floor. I clutched the ledger tighter, every instinct screaming that this was the final confrontation, the moment everything would either collapse or come alive. His face twisted with a desperation I had never seen, not the arrogance of a man certain of victory, but the terror of someone whose last mask was being torn away. "Put it back," he hissed, his voice breaking. "You don't understand what this will do." But I did understand. The names in that ledger weren't just employees or distant associates. They were family, politicians, even community leaders, all complicit in a conspiracy that had silenced victims for decades. My mother's name burned brightest of all, proof that she had betrayed me long before I ever thought she had. The rejection I had carried like a wound wasn't born of disappointment or shame. It was part of a bargain to keep secrets buried. My uncle lunged, but I had been waiting. I darted past him, running through the halls with the ledger pressed against me like a shield. He shouted, cursed, threatened, but his words grew faint as I burst into daylight, my car waiting, my resolve unshakable. Within hours the ledger was in the hands of investigators, its contents explosive enough to unravel generations of corruption. The trial that followed was not just about inheritance anymore. It was about dismantling an empire built on deceit. My uncle was sentenced, my mother publicly disgraced, and the estate transformed into something far greater than wealth. It became a foundation for justice, restitution, and healing. Standing before the press on the day of the final verdict, I finally spoke not as the rejected daughter, but as a survivor who had turned betrayal into resilience, who had carved strength from tragedy. They said a daughter could never be an heir. I told the cameras, my voice steady. But today, I stand not just as an heir of wealth, but of truth. And that truth is more powerful than their lies ever were. My journey had been marked by abandonment, betrayal, and danger, but it ended with justice, survival, and a strength that could no longer be erased. And as I close my statement, I let the final words echo with all the weight of my story, a call not just for myself, but for anyone watching who had ever been silenced. If my story has shown you that even the most broken can rise, then don't just watch. Stand with me. Like this story. Share it. Subscribe, because the fight for justice doesn't end here. It continues with all of us.